Look, if you were around gaming in the 2000s, you probably have fond memories. You also probably have a lot of things you look back on and you kinda hate them. Many times we've talked about all the good that has come from the 2000s era of gaming, but today we're talking about 10 things that gamers in the 2000s hated. Starting off at number 10, look, with the advent of the next generation consoles at the time, the developers finally had the power to realize their true vision. Unfortunately, that vision was kind of washed out and blurry as hell. If the 7th generation of consoles is defined by anything, it's brown and gray, the colors of a generation. Look, games were too colorful, we all said. Color is for babies, and nobody wants to actually see what they're doing in a game. So blast the screen with this eye-searing bloom and motion blur and add a vignette around the edges of the screen for good measure. Don't forget the film grain and the lens flare and cover the lens with Vaseline. Throw in some extreme depth of field effects to really show off that realism because, you know, these games are realistic looking, right? Look, it's like being trapped in a black and white version of a Michael Bay movie. It just, after a while, it really, really hurts the eyes. So many games just looked muddy and brown. Look, we're still complaining about the excessive post-processing effects and screen effects now, but it was way worse in the 2000s. People make fun of Gears of War 1 for how desaturated it looked, but compared to other games like Ubisoft's downloadable survival game, I Am Alive, or even Clive Barker's Jericho, remember that one? It's like an explosion of color compared to these. It was misguided and often ugly as a stylistic choice, but there is a reason why so many developers had this art direction. Look, for one thing, next gen meant that they were able to actually do color grading in games as well as post-processing. It was a new frontier for visuals, so of course, many game developers jumped on it to experiment and see what they could do to push the visuals and like the fidelities and stuff of their games. And of course, with this being a new technology, maybe some people went a little, maybe a lot overboard with this stuff. Look, it was impressive at first, though, I'm not gonna lie. Seeing some of these gritty, realistic, brown-gray games, it was awesome. It felt like looking at real life. By the PlayStation 4 generation, a lot of this was pretty much entirely dead. If anything, developers may have swung too hard in the other direction, making everything super colorful, which has its own set of problems. But in general, I think I'll take too much color over nearly monochromatic every time. The funny thing is, even at the time, there were games making fun of this whole trend, like Uncharted 2. One of the games that didn't go all brown and gray actually had a cheat called the Next Gen filter, which sucked all the color out of the game. You know the trend was dying when one of the main games that inspired it, like we mentioned, the original Gears of War, became a whole lot more colorful by Gears 3 in 2011. The funny thing about this trend was that it was actually pretty short-lived as far as these things go. It kicked off with the Xbox 360's launch in 2005 and was pretty much gone by like 2009, 2010. And even then, it wasn't like literally every game at the time was a washed out visual mess. We were still getting nice, colorful games and stuff, but it's just that it felt like way too many of the biggest budget games just seemed to think that taking out all the color was how you made a game realistic and for a mature audience. Next at number 9, look, if there's two things that go together like chocolate and peanut butter, it's all the brown washed out color stuff we mentioned before, and a generic action game protagonist, characterized by their completely generic faces, which are always just a plain guy. And their choice of hairstyle often is nothing. No hair, or if they do, it's shaved, or like a military cut. If you weren't there, you cannot imagine how many of these generic video game guys there were. It felt like literally every game had one of these guys straight out of the video game character model assembly line. When something came along that didn't look like this, it felt like a sip of water in a desert. The situation was so bad in the 2000s that when they literally made a Warhammer 40k Space Marine game, they gave the protagonist hair. The list of these guys is just endless from the time. They even managed to take previously not bald guys from the last generation and made them bald this time, like Sam Fisher in Double Agent. Like, he goes next gen and suddenly the crew cut gets swapped out for a completely shaved head. Not even a guy with short hair is spared the indignity of becoming a bald Space Marine. They did it to Max Payne too. But when military first-person shooter games and gritty action games were like at an all-time cultural high, and with realism in games reaching a point where they can make a pretty realistic face but not realistic hair, the easy answer was just to make everyone bald to avoid things looking kind of bad. bad. There were a few options for hair in the 2000s. There was, basically helmet hair, which never looked really good, bald, or the rare game from Japan that seemed to actually get hair kind of right. They didn't necessarily look realistic, but you'd think artists over here could take some pointers from their Japanese counterparts, because at least back in this era, they were the only ones seemingly capable of giving someone a proper head of hair, not to mention cool hair. Here's the thing, just because a character fits the bald space marine archetype doesn't automatically make them bad. Some of the best characters of the generation were just generic bald guys at face value. Cole from Infamous is a perfect example. He actually, yes, very much looked like every character, like generic military character box art guy, but there was more to meets the eye. There was more to him beneath the surface. He was cool. He had a lot of personality. Same for, I guess, like Nico from GTA 4, kind of. He's actually very distinct despite his choice of simple hair. But really, when you look back, it's like Spec Ops The Line, Prototype 2, some of the Resistance games, Star Killer, of course, from Force Unleashed, that guy from Too Human. Look, it's not their fault that they're all shaved head guys. It's the industry's fault for just making way too many bald Space Marine generic soldier guys up until everyone was totally sick of them. Next at number 8, these days, regenerating health is just another tool in the toolbox for game designers. It's in games, it's no big deal. But back in the 2000s, it was a real hot button issue. The thing about regenerating health, especially in FPS games, was that people were generally fine with it at first. Games like Halo 1 and especially 2, which had full-on regenerating health, with the first game still had like the health pack to go with the energy shield, nobody really complained too much about them. At least that's from what we can remember. It wasn't until the popularity of games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 where it really started to explode. That's where gamers as a whole really started to turn on the idea of regenerating health, calling it unrealistic and meant for casuals who can't hack it using an actual health bar. Many saw regenerating health as kind of like a modern simplification or dumbing down things for a mass audience in games. Part of what made this whole thing such an easy target was the infamous red jelly from Modern Warfare 2. That's the game that took the on-screen damage just a little too far. So when you took a certain amount of damage, the screen gets covered in blood, which eventually fades away and your health refills. But it was so over the top and blocked so much of the screen that the idea was just rife for parody. Look, the concept was silly on its face, but like looking back, this whole debate, really, now it's not really a big deal. Obviously, the real concern back then was just that many old school gamers just didn't like the direction mainstream shooters were going. They liked their health meters and traditional armor pickups and didn't want them to get replaced with standing behind cover and waiting for like the red jelly to go off the screen or your health bar to slowly come back up. It just encouraged a kind of different play style in the games that used it. Nowadays, though, it's kind of like there's room for both. We see both types of mechanics used in games, and I think the world kind of just continued on. It's funny, though, how some things seem to be a big deal at the time, and then eventually they're just not. Next at number 7, when the Wii launched on November 19th, 2006, it almost instantly blew past all expectations. The thing was huge, man. The GameCube had a lot of great games, but it was, more of a sales disappointment. It didn't pop off as much as Nintendo apparently wanted. And with Nintendo in technically third place in the console wars, I guess, the Wii really changed all that and ended up being the clear winner for a long time. What made the Wii such a success, really? It was the motion controls. Those are what get people in the door. That's what had casual audiences buying this thing up, and it managed to really bring a sizable audience to the platform and into the gaming world. The motion control made Nintendo big money, but its greatest success ended up being the system's biggest curse. The problem is kind of simple, man. Motion controls are fine for, simple little mini games or like, an optional choice for driving games or the rare shooter that actually makes decent use of it. But for everything else, all the games that are essentially just traditional games that can easily be played with a standard controller, being forced to use motion controls kind of sucked ass. And so many games on the Wii and beyond kind of had them. So for example, does a game like Donkey Kong Country Returns really need motion controls? It's just a traditional platformer. For some reason, they make you waggle the controller to roll and do simple actions like slamming the ground. Look, maybe we're grumpy. I didn't think it was that fun. Motion controls oftentimes just like, we were all denying ourselves, we were kidding ourselves, but it made controlling some games needlessly more complicated and sloppier. Good luck if you're like remembering if you're supposed to shake or point the controller forward or move the nunchuck down or whatever, but the biggest problem is just that the motion controls weren't really that good. They, after a while, especially when poorly implemented, just felt kind of unresponsive, exhausting, gimmicky back then. It wasn't really until the Nintendo introduced the Wii Motion Plus that they got pretty good. There's a reason why any motion controls we see now tend to be used very sparingly and tend to be optional, because the success of the Wii just caused the entire industry to react and chase the trend. Remember the 6-axis? Remember how they forced motion controls for all that? And then eventually we even had Xbox Connect? I blame all that on the initial success of the Wii. Maybe that's just like a fan theory, but yeah, anyway. Next at number 6, we've come a long way from 2004, man. It used to be that there were gamers that refused to install Steam. Some of us just found it like this annoying pack-in vaporware. Meanwhile, now, people refuse to use anything else oftentimes. Steam is like the bedrock of the PC gaming community in 2025. You know, you could go so far as to say that PC gaming wouldn't even exist as it is now without Steam. It's so dominant that it's inescapable. You were not playing games on PC without using it, or at least putting a lot of unnecessary effort trying to work around it. But in 2004, nobody could have imagined just how far the platform would end up growing. I certainly did not. Back then, it was just an annoying hoop we all had to jump through to play Half-Life 2 on PC. Back then, it was little more than just kind of DRM. It was just this annoying piece of bloatware. You even had to create a login and everything, which is something that we're all used to now. But in 2004, this was still a new and aggressive idea for a lot of people. A lot of people were just actively annoyed or disliked Steam. And at least back then, they weren't necessarily wrong. Using Steam back then was not like the smooth experience it is now. It was not seamless. Downloads could be kind of slow. The web browser was finicky. The store was pretty rough. It just wasn't a great experience for a long time. It took years and years to build customer confidence in the ecosystem. But eventually, Steam, of course, you know it now, they won people over, slowly but surely. Look, overall, the pros and cons of Steam can be difficult to unpack. There's a whole other video, but essentially, it's hard to deny just how dominant and successful the whole thing is. And in like 2004, with this annoying launcher, we really just didn't see it coming. Next at number 5, believe it or not, like in the era of the Souls-like now, this might sound absurd, but in the late 2000s, there was a lot of anti-boss fight discourse out there. It seemed like everyone hated the good old-fashioned traditional boss fight. It was just think piece after think piece after think piece, and endless forum posts about fans complaining about certain boss battles, man. Now look, as someone here, like we all really love boss battles here, clearly. Like, see the many videos we've done covering that topic. This kind of reactionary turn against the concept was pretty alarming back then. It wasn't just a bunch of loud voices shouting to the ether either. It felt like the developers were kind of listening. For a little while, in the late 2000s, it really did seem like the concept of the classic boss battle was kind of going to go the way of the dodo. Then a little game called Demon's Souls came out in 2009, and everyone started to pretend like they always like boss fights, actually. Okay, look, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, we'll totally admit, but you could see the tide turning, in part because of the critical success of games like Demon's Souls. Look, not even saying that people were wrong to think this. I think specifically a lot of this anti-boss battle sentiment was brought on by just a lot of really bad, undercooked boss battles in games. Like in the PS2 era, things were better, but come Xbox 360 time, there was just a lot of unfun boss encounters in some games. Uncharted 2 had a rough one. Batman Arkham Asylum's last boss just kind of felt half-assed. Borderlands 2 had a few stinkers. Killzone 2. A lot of those games, and similar ones like this, they had some pretty awful final fights that felt kind of anticlimactic. For a while, it just felt like video games couldn't stick the landing that was a big ending battle. So I get why some people just kind of wanted to abolish boss fights forever, but thankfully I'm glad that we didn't go that extreme and we still have boss fights today. Now at number 4, the 90s was the era of the awkward transition to 3D, but in the 2000s, 3D games were fully established. The industry was in the middle of this unprecedented boom, and it seemed like just about everything was up for grabs, and games needed to be made. So why not bring back some old games and give them a grimdark, edgy makeover for the new time period? This wasn't your dad's Bomberman. This is so much worse. Yes, this is real. For whatever reason, the 2000s was like the the era of trying to bring back old and, kind of floundering franchises in the worst ways possible. Japanese companies were especially struggling after the PlayStation 2 era to really kind of adapt to this new gaming environment, and their attempts to kind of edgy or Xboxify old 8-bit and other games were awkward, to say the least. Really, Bomberman Act Zero is the GOAT, the crown jewel of this legacy of weird, awkward stuff. But it's far from the only game. Remember when Capcom tried to Metal Gear Solidify the Bionic Commando games? Or the terrible Final Fight revival for the PlayStation 2 that was trying to ride off the GTA boom? Even Tomb Raider kind of fell into that trap with Angel of Darkness, and that ended up kind of serving as the death knell for the franchise for a while. Even though that one definitely has a soft spot in my heart personally, I will forever defend Angel of Darkness. I understand the bigger picture. Look, there were a lot of these things. Look, for every Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, which was like a good revival of an old property, there was an Altered Beast. Just a bunch of total slop out there that ended up being like the final nail in the coffin for a lot of legendary series. These revivals didn't make anyone happy. The fans of the old games were turned off by the weird direction they took them, and then modern new gamers or consumers just didn't care and didn't buy it. They reviewed poorly, they didn't all sell, and the entire idea of trying to revive a game by retaining nothing about what made it so beloved in the first place, just the name, it just really didn't work for obvious reasons. Now at number 3, buying games online is so easy now, it's so easy to forget just how annoying it used to be for certain marketplaces. While the PS3 made buying games pretty simple, outside of the store being kind of slow on PS3, Microsoft had a much better interface, but then also a way worse currency system. So back in the day, if you wanted to buy something on the Xbox marketplace, you couldn't just put in your credit card information and directly purchase a game. No, you had to get Microsoft's fund money first. For some reason, the amounts didn't line up exactly with real world money either. It was a confusing time. Like if you wanted $5 worth, then you'd get 400 points. It was $1,600 for $20. I have $3,200, I believe, for $40 and so on. So no, you could not buy points in increments smaller than 400. So if you had some extra points, then you were just stuck with them. It was exactly like modern day mobile game style in-game currencies, but for a marketplace. And it sucked. Imagine you had to do this for like the Apple Store or Steam or something. It's ridiculous. And it's kind of shocking how Microsoft managed to sweep this clearly weird, awkward, anti-consumer practice under the rug. I'm glad they did away with all this. Their situation now is much better. It's just stuff like this was rampant back in the day, and we're glad it's dead. Now at number 2, look, this one isn't exclusively a 2000s thing, and I think the real ire only came around the tail end of the 7th generation in 2012, 2013, okay, but the tacked-on multiplayer mode was still a prominent part of games in the 2000s, and generally, people didn't really like it. In the 2000s, the industry was really obsessed with trade-ins, of course, right? Back then, places like GameStop were still doing big business buying and selling used games. Publishers didn't like it, though, because if a used game got sold, then that was a sale that they were denied. They didn't get. GameStop did. So they were coming up with all kinds of ways to deter reselling games. And one major idea that a lot of big studios seemed to like was to make tacked on multiplayer modes to games that were originally single player only, maybe in the hopes of keeping people playing a little bit longer. Compared to taking single player games and transforming them into live service stuff like this whole thing, like it might sound pretty quaint, but there was reason for concern. The biggest problem at the time had this kind of thing like how it was all taking development time and money away from the single player to make this bad multiplayer that nobody wanted to play anyway. Look, some people just didn't like the idea of multiplayer being part of their favorite franchises, and a lot of times these modes just weren't good. For every game that actually got a solid multiplayer mode, like the surprisingly good multiplayer games in Assassin's Creed 2 or even the early Uncharted games, there was bizarre, out-of-place stuff like Metroid Prime 2 or the BioShock 2 multiplayer, or the fact that Spec Ops The Line had multiplayer, which it seems like nobody wanted. That was like a story game. Now, with multiplayer and single player mostly being separate releases outside of some massive blockbuster games like Call of Duty, it's easy to be a little nostalgic for these goofy little multiplayer modes that you got along with a single player game, but make no mistake, a lot of the stuff was not really worth it. We only even remember the ones that are actually really good. Like, remember Dead Space 2's multiplayer? Yes, that was a thing. And it was shockingly okay. Still though, it was something that nobody really asked for. Now, down at number 1, while later generations have kind of come to accept and embrace DLC or downloadable content, for gamers from the 2000s, it was still public enemy number 1. We all remember Horse Armor, and while many fought the good fight, nobody could have guessed that the game was rigged right from the start, man. The thing about DLC is that most of the earliest forms of DLC came as free updates. It wasn't until the Xbox and PS3 did we start seeing DLC cost actual real-world money. Many recognized that slippery slope that the industry was on pretty early, and many railed against DLCs right from the start. But it was just too easy of a moneymaker. Horse Armor is easy and cheap for them to make, and sold for $5, it's probably a big win for them. That form of DLC is still around and stronger than ever. But one thing that was a big problem in the 2000s, but is mostly gone these days, is the Season Pass. I'm talking about the original definition of the Season Pass, like the old version. The one that was meant exclusively for multiplayer games where they sold extra maps in a pack that you would buy ahead of time. Season Passes still exist and are, if anything, more prevalent than ever as far as traditional DLC goes, but its original form was not good. It was awkward and it was just about selling multiplayer maps. This was the original way multiplayer games made some extra scratch. It was what these games did before endless loot boxes and battle passes and stuff. What sucked about these things is obvious in hindsight. Selling paid maps for multiplayer splits the community into players who have the maps and the ones who don't. They messed around, they tried different ways, but ultimately it still just ended up causing more problems than it solves, and ultimately was doing long-term damage to the games that ended up trying to use this process. So that's why by the early 2010s, these kinds of games were moving away from that old Season Pass thing and made all multiplayer maps available, accessible to all people who got the game. But because they weren't charging for maps anymore, that means they had to make their extra money someplace else, of course. Sometimes this was done with the dreaded multiplayer pass, where you had to use a code to gain access to multiplayer. If you bought the game secondhand and there was no code or it was already used, then it's going to cost you to buy a code and sign up. This wasn't really a thing in the 2000s. This was more of like an early 2010s thing, and most developers moved on from it pretty quickly because we all dunked on it so bad. Then they kind of moved on to a worse version of loot boxes before finally kind of settling on battle passes, and that's where we are now. DLC is always going to be a part of video games now. It seems like it's just too much of a moneymaker for developers to really like abandon the idea, but gamers of a certain age remember how much everyone despised this stuff in the 2000s. And now 58% of PC gaming revenue came from microtransactions. It's hard not to feel a little sick when you see a number like that, but that's where we're at. And these are things that 2000s gamers really hated. A lot of interesting stuff here, a good trip down memory lane. So let us know how you feel. If you were around gaming, if you were in the gaming world, the gaming discourse online at the time, do you remember this stuff? Did you feel differently? Let's talk about any of this down in the comments. If you like this video, clicking the like button helps us out. We really appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing, maybe hitting that notification bell because we put out new videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.